Give me 1 second, everyone.
Honor of a visit from the Death Watch Guard. Lord Matt? Who under the light was Lord Matt? Furik Kareed, Kareed said. I wish to speak with the man who calls himself Tom Maryland. Dalmanis Delavind, the man said, finding manners. You want to talk to Tom? Well, I see no harm in it. I will take you to him. Kareed healed Aldazar after Delavind. The man had made no mention of the obvious, that he and the others could not be allowed to leave and carry word of this army's location. He had some manners. At least they would not be allowed to leave unless Kareed's mad plan worked. Lasenge gave him only 1 chance in 10 of success, 1 in 5 of living. Personally, he himself believed the odds longer, but he had to make the attempt. And Maryland's presence argued in favor of the High Lady's presence. Delavind dismounted at an oddly domestic scene among the trees. People on camp stools or blankets around a small fire beneath a spreading oak where a kettle was heating. Kareed stepped down from his saddle, motioning the guards and Ajimbura to dismount as well. Palatine and Mylan remained on their mounts for the advantage of height. Of all people, Mistress Anand, who had once owned the inn where he stayed in Abu Dar, was sitting on one of the 3-legged stools reading a book. She no longer wore one of those revealing dresses he had enjoyed looking at, but her close-fitting necklace still dangled that small jeweled knife onto her impressive bosom. She closed her book and gave him a small nod, as if he had returned to the wandering woman after an absence of a few hours. Her hazel eyes were quite composed. Perhaps the plot was even more intricate than the seeker Moore had thought. A tall, lean, white-haired man with mustaches nearly as long as Hartha's was sitting cross-legged on a striped blanket across a stones board from a slender woman with her hair in many beaded braids. He quirked an eyebrow at Kareed, shook his head, and returned to perusing the cross-hatched board. She glared pure hatred at Kareed and those behind him. A gnarled old fellow with long white hair was lying on another blanket with a remarkably ugly young boy, playing some game or other on a piece of red cloth spider-webbed with black lines. They sat up, the boy studying the ogier with interest, the man with one hand hovering as if to reach for a knife beneath his coat. A dangerous man and wary. Perhaps he was Maryland. 2 men and 2 women sitting together on camp stools had been conversing when Kareed rode up. But as he was stepping down, a stern-faced woman stood and fixed her blue eyes on his in very nearly a challenge. She wore a sword on a wide leather strap slanting across her chest, the way some sailors did. Her hair was close-cropped, rather than cut in the style of the low-blood. Her fingernails were short, and none were lacquered, but he was certain she was Eginin Tamaroth. A heavy-set man with hair as short as hers and one of those odd Ilianer beards stood beside her, one hand on the hilt of a short sword, staring at Kareed as if he intended to second her challenge. A pretty woman with dark, waist-long hair and the same rosebud mouth as the Terraboner stood, and for a moment it seemed she might kneel or prostrate herself, but then she straightened and looked him right in the eyes. The last man, a lean fellow in a peculiar red cap, who looked carved from dark wood, laughed and flung his arms around her. The grinning stare he gave Kareed could only be called triumphant. Tom, Delavin said, this is Varric Careed. He wants to talk with a man who calls himself Tom Maryland. With me, the lean white-haired man said, rising awkwardly. His right leg appeared slightly stiff. An old battle injury, perhaps? But I don't call myself Tom Maryland. It's my name, though I'm surprised you know it. What do you want of me? Careed removed his helmet, but before he could open his mouth, a pretty woman with large brown eyes rushed up, pursued by two others. All three had those Aes Sedai faces, 1 minute looking 20, the next twice that, the third somewhere in the middle. It was very disconcerting. That's Shireen, the pretty woman cried, staring at Mylan. Release her! You do not understand, Jolene, one of the women with her said angrily. Thin-lipped, with a narrow nose, she looked as if she could chew rocks. She do not be Shireen any longer. She would have betrayed us, given a chance. Veslin is right, Jolene, the third woman. Handsome rather than pretty, she had long black hair that fell in waves to her waist. She would have betrayed us. I don't believe it, Edicina, Jolene snapped. You will free her immediately, she told Melatine, or I'll... Suddenly she gasped. I did tell you, Teslin said bitterly. A young man in a wide-brimmed black hat galloped up on a dark, blunt-nosed chestnut with a deep chest and flung himself out of the saddle. What's bloody going on here? He demanded, striding up to the fire. Careed ignored him. The High Lady Tuon had ridden up with the young man on a black and white horse with markings like none he had ever seen. Selucia was at her side on a dun, her head wrapped in a scarlet scarf, but he had eyes only for the High Lady. Short black hair covered her head, but he could never mistake that face. She spared him only one expressionless glance before returning to a study of the young man. Careed wondered whether she recognized him. Probably not. It had been a long time since he had served in her bodyguard. He did not look over his shoulder, but he knew that the reins of Ajimbura's chestnut were now held by one of the guards. Apparently unarmed and his distinctive braid gone, he should have no problem leaving the camp. The sentries would never see the little man. Ajimbura was a good runner as well as stealthy. Soon Musenge would know that the High Lady was indeed here. She has shielded us, Matt, Jolene said, and the young man snatched off his hat and strode to Melatine's horse as if he intended to seize the bridle. He was long-limbed, though he could not be called tall, and he wore a black silk scarf tied around his neck and dangling onto his chest. That made him the one everyone had called Tylin's toy, as if being the Queen's plaything were the most important feature of him. Likely it was. Playthings seldom had another side to them. Strange, but he hardly seemed handsome enough for that. He did look fit, though. Release the shield, he told her, as if he expected obedience. Careed's eyebrows rose. This was the plaything? Melatine and Mylan gasped almost as one, and the young man barked a laugh. You see, it doesn't work on me. Now you bloody well release the shields, or I'll bloody well haul you out of the saddle and paddle your bottoms. Melatine's face darkened. Few people dared speak to a Dare Suldam. Release the shields, Melatine, Careed said. The Marath Damani was on the point of embracing Sayadar, she said, instead of obeying. There's no telling what she might have... Release the shields, he said firmly, and release the power. The young man gave a satisfied nod, then suddenly spun, pointing a finger at the three Aes Sedai. Now don't you bloody well start. She's let go of the power, you do it too. Go ahead. Again he nodded, for all the world as if he were sure they had obeyed. From the way Melatine was staring at him, perhaps he was. Maybe he was an Ashaman? Perhaps Ashaman could detect a Damani's channeling somehow. That hardly seemed likely, but it was all Careed could think of. Yet that hardly squared with how Tylen reportedly had treated the young man. One of these days, Matt Cawthon, Jolene said acidly, someone will teach you to show proper respect to Aes Sedai, and I hope I am there to see it. The High Lady and Selucia laughed uproariously. It was good to see she had managed to keep her spirits up in captivity. Doubtless her maid's companionship had helped. But it was time to get on, too. Time to take his mad gamble. General Marilyn, Karit said, you fought a short but remarkable campaign and achieved miracles at keeping your forces undetected. But your luck is about to run out. General Chyson deduced your real purpose. He has turned his army around and is marching for the Malvidi Narrows as fast as he can. He will be here in 2 days. I have 10,000 men not far from here, enough to pin you until he arrives. But the High Lady Tuan would be in danger, and I want to avoid that. Let me leave with her, and I will allow you and your men to depart unhindered. You can be well the other side of the mountains into the Mulvane Gap before Chyson arrives, and into Murundi before he can catch you. The only other choice is annihilation. Chyson has enough men to wipe you out. It won't be a battle. 100,000 men against 8,000 will be a slaughter. They heard him out, every face as blank as if they were stunned. They schooled themselves well. Or perhaps they were stunned at Marilyn's plan apparently unraveling at the last instant. Marilyn stroked one of his white mustaches with a long finger. He seemed to be hiding a smile. I fear you have mistaken me, Banner General Karit. For the space of a sentence, his voice became extremely resonant. I am a Gleeman, a position higher than Court Bard, to be sure, but no general. The man you want is Lord Matram Cawthon. He made a small bow toward the young man who was settling his flat-topped hat back on his head. Karit frowned. Tylan's toy was the general? Were they playing a game with him? You have about 100 men, Death Watch guards, and maybe 20 gardeners, Cawthon said calmly. From what I hear, that could make an even fight against 5 times their number for most soldiers. But the band aren't most soldiers, and I have a sight more than 600. As for Chyson, if that's the fellow who pulled back through the Narrows, even if he has figured out what I was up to, he couldn't get back in less than 5 days. My scout's last reports had him pushing southwest along the Abu Dar Road as fast as he could march. The real question is this, though. Can you get Tuan to the Terracin Palace safely? Karit felt as if Hartha had kicked him in the belly, and not only because the man had used the High Lady's name so casually. You mean to let me take her away? He said incredulously. If she trusts you, if you can get her to the palace safely. She's in danger till she reaches that. In case you don't know it, your whole bloody ever-victorious flaming army is ready to slit her throat or bash in her head with a rock. I know, Karit said, more calmly than he felt. Why would this man just release the High Lady after the White Tower had gone through all the trouble of kidnapping her? Why, after fighting that short, bloody campaign? We will die to the man if that is what is needed to see her safe. It will be best if we set out immediately. Before the man changed his mind, before Karit woke from this fever dream. It surely seemed a fever dream. Not so fast. Cawthon turned toward the High Lady. Tuan, do you trust this man to see you safe to the palace in Abu Dar? Karit stifled an impulse to wince. General and lord the man might be, but he had no right to use the High Lady's name so. I trust the Death Watch guards with my life, the High Lady replied calmly. And him more than any other. She favored Karit with a smile. Even as a child, smiles from her had been rare. Do you, by any chance, still have my doll, Banner General Karit? He bowed to her formally. The manner of her speaking told him she was still under the veil. Forgiveness, High Lady. I lost everything in the great fire of Sohima. That means you kept it for 10 years. You have my commiseration on the loss of your wife and of your son, though he died bravely and well. Few men will enter a burning building once. He saved 5 people before he was overcome. Kareed's throat tightened. She had followed news of him. All he could do was bow again, more deeply. Enough of that, Cawthon muttered. You're gonna knock your head on the ground if you keep that up. As soon as she and Selusha can get their things together, you take them out of here and ride hard. Talmanis, rouse the band. It isn't that I don't trust you, Kareed, but I think I'll sleep easier beyond the Narrows. Matrim Cawthon is my husband, the High Lady said in a loud, clear voice. Everyone froze where they stood. Matrim Cawthon is my husband. Kareed felt as if Hartha had kicked him again. No, not Hartha. Aldazar. What madness was this? Cawthon looked like a man watching an arrow fly towards his face, knowing he had no chance to dodge. Bloody Matrim Cawthon is my husband. That is the wording you used, is it not? This had to be a fever dream. It took a minute before Matt could speak. Burn him, it seemed to take a bloody hour before he could move. When he could, he snatched off his hat, strode to Tuon, and seized the razor's bridle. She looked down at him, cool as any queen on a bloody throne. All those battles with the flaming dice rattling away in his head, all those skirmishes and raids, and they had to stop when she said a few words. Well, at least this time he knew what had happened that was bloody fateful for Matt Bloody Cawthon. Why? I mean, I knew you were going to sooner or later, but why now? I like you. Maybe more than like you. And I enjoy kissing you, he thought. Kareed grunted. But you haven't behaved like a woman in love. You're ice half the time and spend most of the rest digging under my skin. Love? Tuon sounded surprised. Perhaps we will come to love one another, Matrim. But I have always known I would marry to serve the Empire. What do you mean, you knew that I was going to speak the words? Call me Matt. Only his mother had ever called him Matrim when he was in trouble, and his sisters when they were carrying tales to get him in trouble. Your name is Matrim. What did you mean? He sighed. The woman never wanted much, just her own way, like just about every other woman he had ever known. I went through a Tirangriel to somewhere else, another world maybe. The people there aren't really people. They look like snakes. But they'll answer 3 questions for you, and their answers are always true. One of mine was that I'd marry the daughter of the 9 moons. But you haven't answered my question. Why now? A faint smile on her lips, Tuon leaned down from her saddle and rapped him hard in the top of his head with her knuckles. Your superstitions are bad enough, Matrim, but I won't tolerate lies. An amusing lie, true, but still a lie. It's the light's own truth, he protested, clapping his hat on. Maybe it would give him some protection. You could learn for yourself if you could make yourself talk to an Aes Sedai. They could tell you about the Aelfin and the Eelfin. It could be the truth, Edicina piped up as if she were being helpful. The Aelfin can be reached through a Tirangriel in the Stone of Tyr, so I understand. And supposedly they give true answers. Matt glared at her. A fat lot of help she was with her, so I understands and supposedlys. Tuon continued to stare at him as if Edicina had not opened her mouth. I answered your question, Tuon, so you answer mine. You know that the money can tell fortunes? She gave him a stern look, like expecting him to call it superstition, but he nodded curtly. Some Aes Sedai could foretell the future. Why not a Damani? I asked Lydia to tell mine just before I landed at Abu Dar. This is what she said. Beware the fox that makes the ravens fly, for he will marry you and carry you away. Beware the man who remembers Hawkwing's face, for he will marry you and set you free. Beware the man of the red hand, for him you will marry and none other. It was your ring that caught my eye first. He thumbed the long ring unconsciously, and she smiled. A small smile, but a smile. A fox apparently startling 2 ravens in flight, and 9 crescent moons. Suggestive, wouldn't you say? And just now, you fulfilled the second part. So I knew for certain it was you. Solution made a sound in her throat, and Tuan waggled fingers at her. The bosomy little woman subsided, adjusting her headscarf, but the look she shot at Matt should have been accompanied by a dagger in her hand. He laughed mirthlessly. Blood and bloody ashes. The ring was a carver's tri-piece, bought only because it stuck on his finger. He would give up those memories of Hawkwing's face along with every other old memory if it would get the bloody snakes out of his head. And yet those things had gained him a wife. The Band of the Red Hand would never have existed without those old memories of battles. Seems to me being Taviran works on me as much as it does on anybody else. For a moment, he thought she was going to rap him again. He gave her his best smile. One more kiss before you leave? I'm not in the mood at the moment, she said coolly. That hanging magistrate was back. All prisoners to be condemned immediately. Perhaps later. You could return to Abu Dar with me. You have an honored place in the Empire now. He did not hesitate before shaking his head. There was no honored place waiting for Lylwyn or Doman. No place at all for the Aes Sedai or the Band. The next time I see Sean Chen, I expect it will be on the field somewhere, Tuan. Burn him it would be. His life seemed to run that way no matter what he did. You're not my enemy, but your empire is. Nor are you my enemy, husband, she said coolly. But I live to serve the empire. Well, I suppose you'd better get your things. He trailed off at the sound of a cantering horse approaching. Vannin reined in a rangy gray beside Tuan, eyed Kareed and the other Death Watch guards, then spat through a gap in his teeth and leaned on the high pommel of his saddle. There's 10,000 or so soldiers at a little town about 5 miles west of here, the fat man told Matt. Only one man Sean Chen near as I could learn. The rest are Altarans, Terrabonners, Amavisians. All mounted. Thing is, they're asking after fellows wearing armor like that. He nodded toward Kareed. And rumor says the one of them that kills a girl that sounds a lot like the High Lady gets himself 100,000 crowns gold. Their mouths are dripping for it. I can slip past them, Kareed said. His bluff face looked fatherly. His voice sounded like a drawn sword. And if you can't? Matt asked quietly. It can't be chance they're this close. They've caught some sniff of you. One more smell might be all it takes to kill Tuan. Kareed's face darkened. Do you intend to go back on your word? A drawn blade that might be used soon. Worse, Tuan was watching, looking at Matt like that hanging magistrate in truth. Burn him if she died, something would shrivel up inside him. And the only way to stop it, to be sure it was stopped, was to do what he hated worse than work. Once he had thought that fighting battles, much as he hated it, was still better than work. Near enough 900 dead in the space of a few days had changed his mind. No, he said. She goes with you. But you leave me a dozen of your Death Watch guards and some of the gardeners. If I'm going to take these people off your back, I need them to think I'm you.
Tuan abandoned most of the clothing Matrim had bought for her, since she would need to travel light. The little cluster of red silk rosebuds he had given her she tucked away in her saddlebags, folded in a linen cloth, as carefully as if it were blown glass. She had no farewells to make except for Mistress Annan. She really would miss their discussions, so she and Selusha were ready to ride quickly. Mylan smiled so broadly at the sight of her that she had to pat the little Damani. It seemed that word of what had happened had spread, because as they rode through the camp with the Death Watch guards, men of the band stood and bowed to her. It was very like reviewing regiments in Shondar. "What do you make of him?" she asked Kareed, once they were away from the soldiers and beginning to canter. There was no need to say which he she meant. "It is not my place to make judgments, High Lady," he said gravely. His head swiveled, keeping watch on the surrounding trees. "I serve the Empire and the Empress, may she live forever. As do we all, Banner General, but I ask your judgment. A good general, High Lady, he replied without hesitation. Brave, but not overly brave. He won't get himself killed just to show how brave he is, I think. And he is adaptable. A man of many layers. And if you will forgive me, High Lady, a man in love with you. I saw how he looked at you. In love with her? Perhaps. She thought she might be able to come to love him. Her mother had loved her father, it was said. And a man of many layers. Matrim Coffin made an onion look like an apple. She rubbed a hand over her head. She still was not accustomed to the feel of hair on her head. I will need a razor first thing. It may be best to wait until Ebudar, High Lady. No, she said gently. If I die, I will die as who I am. I have removed the veil. As you say, Highness. Smiling, he saluted, gauntleted fists striking over his heart hard enough that steel clanged on steel. If we die, we will die as who we are.
Chapter 37. Prince of the Ravens. Leaning on the tall pommel of his saddle, Ashandarai slanted across Pips's neck. Matt frowned at the sky. The sun was well past its noon height. If Vannon and those Death Watch guards did not return soon, he might find himself fighting a battle with the sun in the crossbowman's eyes, or worse, in twilight. Worst of all, dark clouds loomed over the mountains to the east. The gusting wind was out of the north. No help there. Rain would put the weasel in the hen yard. Bowstrings fared poorly in rain. Well, any rain was a few hours off, with luck. But he had never noticed his luck saving him from getting soaked in a downpour. He had not dared wait until tomorrow. Those fellows hunting Tuon might have gotten another whiff of Kharid's men, and then he would have had to try attacking them or laying an ambush and carry it out before they could catch Kharid. Better to have them come to him at a place of his choosing. Finding the proper spot had not been difficult between Master Roydell's collection of maps on the one hand and Vannon and the other scouts on the other. Aludra was fussing over one of her tall, metal-bound lofting tubes, beaded braids hiding her face as she examined something at the broad wooden base. He wished she had been willing to remain with the pack animals like Tom and Mistress Anand. Even Noel had been willing to stay, if only to help Julian and Almathera make sure Olver did not run off to watch the battle. The boy was dead eager, which could soon lead to plain dead. Matters had been bad enough when only Harnan and the other three had been corrupting Olver, but now he had half the men teaching him how to use a sword or dagger, or fight with his hands and feet, and apparently filling his head with tales of heroes from the way he had been behaving, begging to go on raids with Matt and the like. Aludra was near as bad. Anybody could have used one of those strikers to light the fuse once she had loaded that tube, but she insisted on doing it herself. She was a fierce woman, Aludra was, and none too pleased at finding herself on the same side as Sean-Chan, however temporary the arrangement was. It seemed wrong to her that they would see some of her handiwork without being on the receiving end. Lylewyn and Doman sat their horses nearby, keeping an eye on her, as much to make sure she did nothing foolish as to protect her. Matt hoped Lylewyn did nothing foolish herself. Since there was apparently only one Sean-Chan with the people they would fight today, she had decided it was all right to be there, and the way she glared at Musenge and the other Death Watch guards, it seemed she might think she had something to prove to them. The three Aes Sedai, standing together with their reins in hand, cast dark looks at the Sean-Chan too, as did Blerick and Fen, who caressed their sword hilts, perhaps unconsciously. Jolene and her two warders had been the only ones aghast at Shireen's willing departure with Tuon. What an Aes Sedai felt on any subject was usually how her warders felt on it too, but the memory of being leashed had to be too fresh for Edicina or Teslin to feel comfortable around Sean-Chan soldiers. Bethaman and Sita stood very meekly, hands folded at their waists, a little apart from the sisters. Bethaman's light-colored bay nudged her shoulder with his nose, and the tall, dark woman half reached up to stroke the animal before snatching her hand back down and resuming her humble pose. They still would take no part. Jolene and Edicina had made that plain, yet it seemed they wanted the two women under their eyes to make sure of it. The Sean-Chan women plainly were looking at anything but the Sean-Chan soldiers. For that matter, Bethaman and Sita and Lylewyn might as well not have existed, for all of Musenge and that lot. Burn him, they were were so many tensions in the air he could almost feel that hanging rope around his neck again. Pips stamped a hoof, impatient at standing in one place so long, and Matt patted his neck, then scratched the scar forming on his own jaw. Tuon's ointments had stung as badly as she said they would, but they weren't. His new collection of scars did itch yet, though. Tuon. His wife. He was married. He had known it was coming, had known for a long time, but just the same. Married. He should have felt different somehow, but he still felt like himself. He intended to keep it that way, burn him if he did not. If Tuon expected Matt Cawthon to settle down, to give up gambling or some such, she had another think coming. He supposed he would have to give over chasing after women, much less catching them, but he would still enjoy dancing with them, and looking at them, just not when he was with her. Burn him if he knew when that would be. He was not about to go anywhere she had the upper hand, her and her talk of cupbearers and running grooms and marrying to serve the Empire. How was marrying him supposed to serve the flaming Empire? Musenge left the other 10 men and 5 Ogier in red and black armor, and trotted his black gelding up to Matt. The horse had good lines, built for speed and endurance both, as far as Matt could tell without a thorough examination. Musenge looked built for endurance, a stocky, stolid man, his face worn but hard, his eyes like polished stones. "Forgiveness, Highness," he drawled, banging a gauntleted fist against his breastplate. "But shouldn't the men be back to work?" He slurred his words worse than Selucia, almost to unintelligibility. "Their rest break has stretched a long time. I doubt they can complete the wall before the traitor arrives as it is." Matt had wondered how long it would take him to mention that. He had expected it earlier. Open-faced helmets off, but breastplates strapped on, the crossbowmen were sitting on the ground behind a long, curving wall, perhaps a third of a circle made of earth thrown up out of the 4-foot-deep trench fronting it, with a thicket of sharpened stakes driven into the ground in front of that, and extending a little beyond the ends of the trench. They had finished that in short order. Infantry needed to be as handy with shovel, mattock, and axe as they were with weapons. Even cavalry did, but making horsemen believe was harder. Footmen knew it was better to have something between you and the enemy, if you could. The tools lay scattered along the trench now. Some of the men were dicing, others just taking their ease, even napping. Soldiers slept any chance they got. A few were reading books, of all things. Reading.